Hello Crafty friends, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be looking at 5 creative ways to use coordinating stamps and dies. Now if you haven't heard of them before, then coordinating dies are those metal pieces that are shaped to be the same as your stamps, so you can cut out a stamped image. There are many of these available, and many of your favorite stamp sets will have coordinating dies available to you. They can get a little expensive, so I wanted to share some creative ways to use them other than just kind of a stamp it down and cut it out. So let's jump right in with the first way, and this is to make a custom shaker window. If you're new to making shaker cards, then I'll include a link in the corner here to a video that I have on shaker card hacks and tips. But for this one, I'm starting off with a piece of vellum. The vellum is this semi-transparent paper that I have in the background of my MISTI here. It's kind of hard to see at the moment, but you'll be able to see it when I hold it up. And then I've grabbed this jar stamp set. This is from an older Lawn Fawn stamp set called Bugs and Kisses. And I'm stamping that down just using some Memento Tuxedo Black ink. I wanted to include a bug inside of my jar, so I grabbed this little bee. Maybe he could be a firefly, but to me he looks like a bee, so I stamped him down inside of the jar, and then I'm going to move into the die cutting. So for this, I've grabbed a piece of cardstock that will be the front panel of my card, and then I'm just lining up that jar die exactly where I want it to be, where I want the shaker window to be on the front of my card. I'll use some purple tape to hold this in place. This is a great tape for die cutting. It will hold everything really firmly, but then will peel up nicely. And for the most part, it shouldn't rip your cardstock. If you have any issues, you can kind of remove a bit of the stick before you use it just by pressing it on your arm or your trousers. It do the trick for you. So here I have some skinny double-sided tape, and I've sped you up a little bit. I'm just outlining that jar with some double-sided sticky tape, and that's going to allow me to add the image that we just stamped, which will seal up the window. So we'll go from having this hole in the cardstock to having a window instead that is semi-transparent because we've used the vellum. You could also use an overhead transparency sheet or some spare plastic that you have lying around, maybe some packaging if you wanted to recycle that, and make a completely see-through window. You just have to make sure to use an ink that is compatible with the material that you're stamping on. A Stays-On ink, for example, would work really well on plastic. So then I grabbed some Copics and I'm just colouring on the back of my vellum just so it has a slightly more muted look to that colouring. And I've left this in because it's relatively quick, but for the rest of the colouring in the video I will skip ahead, but I'll include links below to the Copics that I've used. So now it's time to build up a well for our shaker material. I'll be using sequins for this video. So I've grabbed some of my 3M foam tape and I'm just folding that in half so I have a double thickness. I'm then going to trim one of the corners at an angle, or miter one of the corners if you're more familiar with kind of woodworking. And you'll see that I do that on the opposite corner as well, and then I just work my way around the card. I go into more detail in my shaker hacks video as to why I do this. It just provides a really nice kind of fresh edge around the card. As you can see, I went ahead and finished that here, and I'll be sure to link to that shaker hacks video. So now I'm adding some sequins into the center of my card. They kind of ran away a little bit, so I'm just using a brush to push them back into the middle. Now, I did not think about using such clear and white sequins on a white background. With the transparent, kind of semi-transparent nature of the vellum, you can't really see these when I stick those down, but I left this in just because I wanted to show you we all make mistakes and usually they're fixable. So here I peeled off the backing of my sticky tape and I'm centering that up and I stick that down. Now you would think that I would have paid attention and noticed that I couldn't see the sequins as I was doing this, but I didn't. So I went ahead and pressed everything down and then I realized my mistake. So I carefully ran my craft knife along the edge of that tape, and because I'd only just stuck it down and I hadn't pressed really firmly, I was able to peel that up and then add some nice bright sequins. So now you can see those inside the shaker jar, and I'm going to press really firmly to stick everything around so nothing flies out the side. So there we have the shaker jar. Now one more thing that I probably should have done before I assembled this was stamp a sentiment, but because I used that nice wide foam tape, I knew I had a nice flat surface to stamp against, and I added that Bugs and Kisses sentiment. Okay, so that is the first example. For the second example, we will be making a colouring stamp, which is a way to add colour as if you had coloured in your stamped image without actually colouring it in. I hope that makes sense. For this, you will want to use something that is symmetrical, so these scissors work perfectly. And these are from a Gina K stamp set, and it is the Crafty Notes Stamp and Die set. I've trimmed out some inexpensive craft foam and I'll run that through my die cut machine using the die, and once I have that cut I'll be able to add it to a stamp block and use it as if it was a solid image stamp. So I'll pop it out here and then grab some Gina K tape runner, and I'm adding that to the back of this piece, and then I'll stick it down to an acrylic block. Now this won't damage your acrylic block, you'll be able to remove any of the residue left behind by this adhesive, but this will just give you a faux mounted stamp. I'm using some ink from Simon Says Stamp. This is actually a hybrid ink, so it's a little juicier than a dye ink. It's kind of a halfway midpoint between a dye and a pigment ink, so it will give more full coverage, and that's exactly what I want for this solid stamp here. And I mean, it's not really a stamp, so I want to give it all the help it can get to get a good solid impression. So I'm just working on a piece of laminated cardstock for any of the mess that I create here as I'm stamping. I'm going to fill in an entire background, and it's always best to make sure that you stamp off the edge of the paper when you're doing this so it looks like a true design from a sheet of paper that you've cut down for a card rather than focusing everything in the center. So I'm just going to work my way around, kind of inking up and stamping down this piece. You may find that because your craft foam is a lot smaller, it's I'm going to say short, but that's not really the right word, but it doesn't have much of a profile raised off of that acrylic block. So you may find that you get some ink on your acrylic block as you're inking up your fake stamp. Just go ahead and wipe that off with a baby wipe to make sure that you don't get any of that onto your card project. And then once you have your entire background stamped up, it's ready to move on to the next step. So I've gone ahead and cleaned my laminated mat, and then I'll just peel off the foam stamp that we created and just rub away any of the excess residue on that stamping block. So now I'm just going to go ahead and add the detail over the top of that coloured background. So we have that solid colour stamp that we created, and now we're adding the detail just using some black ink so the scissors really come to life. I think this is a really fun effect to create a kind of coloured outside of the lines background, and I think these scissors in orange look just perfect. So to turn that stamped panel into a card, I'm going to need a sentiment strip. I've inked up one of the sentiments from the same stamp set, and I'll stamp that down over to the left hand side, and then in that space on the right hand side I'll be able to add another scissors image. So I'm just lining everything up in my MISTI. It just makes it a little easier to do my stamping. If I make any mistakes, I can kind of double stamp, or if I want the image to be a bit darker, I can double stamp, so everything kind of works out perfect. So I trimmed down that stamped panel, and then I created a piece of coloured cardstock just by running that same ink that was used for the shadow stamping. I ran that around the outside of a piece of cardstock, and then I'll go ahead and stick down the stamped panel. And because just a small portion of that will stick out of the edges, it looks as though I had a perfectly coordinating piece of cardstock in my stash. So once that's firmly stuck in place, I'll go ahead and add the sentiment strip that we just created. I was trying to decide whether I wanted it at the top or in the middle or at the bottom of the card, and in the end I went for the top. I'm again using that Gina K adhesive tape runner to stick this down in place. And I'm using the lines on my grid mat to try and help me center this up, although I realise that my card is slightly wonky on the grid mat, but somehow it seemed to work out okay. Then I'll add some tape runner to the back of this piece and add it to my card base. As I was looking at this piece, I felt like that sentiment strip didn't really pop as much as I would have wanted it to, and I was trying to figure out how I could fix this after I'd stuck everything down, and I decided to bring in some of my Love from Lizi peel-off strips just to outline that piece. You can't really see them on camera here, but they look lovely in person. These are the clear iridescent, so they just add a little bit of sparkle outside the edge. I was kind of fighting with this piece here. These are the pinstripe version, so they're very thin, straight lines, and they're great for just adding a little bit of detail like this. And you can easily cut them with your craft knife, so you can just lay them down where you want them, and then press your craft knife into them and they will cut. You can of course cut them with scissors, but I like to do it this way rather than eyeball and maybe cut them a little too short. And then that is this card finished. So that is example 2, creating some colouring using your dies. And moving into example 3, we're going to create a background highlight. I love this design. I'm not usually much of a cat person, but this little stamp is adorable. It's from My Favourite Things, and it's from the Good Friends stamp and die set. And I just think this one turned out so cute. I think it's maybe my favourite. So here I have the die and I'm sticking it down to a piece of blue cardstock, and I'll run that through my die cut machine twice. So you'll see I popped one of them out, and then I'm just going to reuse that same piece of purple tape to hold it in place and run it through my die cut machine again. So I'll have 2 of those images cut out and just 1 stamped down. So to create the shadow effect, we will want to cut out our stamped image as well. And I'll show you a little trick here for getting perfect placement. I'm actually going to use the negative space of my previous die cutting, and I just cut a small section in the bottom there and it will make it easier to remove in a second. I place that over the top of my image exactly where I'd want the die to be, and then I tape that in place and carefully remove the excess, and that means that I'm going to get an even amount of that white edge around the stamped image when I run this through the die cut machine. I hope that makes sense. I've shown that in a couple of videos, but if that is a new trick to you, that is a really useful one. So now I'm grabbing those solid images and I've added adhesive all over the back of the cat. I also coloured it in, and I'm going to stick this first one slightly to the left and slightly higher than the image. Then I'm going to grab the second one and I'm going to do the opposite. Rather than sticking it perfectly in line, I'm going to move it slightly to the right and slightly down. And you'll see here when I place this against a white background, that just allows that coloured cardstock to peep out around the edges of that cat and create a background shadow. So here we have the card base, and I'm adding the sentiment. Again, this was just taken from that same stamp set, and then I completely covered the back of this little kitty with my favourite foam squares. These are scrapbook adhesive foam squares, and then I'll place that down onto this white note card. It is so simple, but I think the addition of that bright coloured cardstock and the fact that the little kitty's collar has been coordinated and kind of colour matched, it looks so cute. Here I have my card base and I'm adding some more of that kind of Tiffany blue cardstock. I actually forget where I got this cardstock from and which exact colour it is, so apologies, I won't have it listed below. Maybe one of you guys might be able to recognise it and say where it is from. It's probably Gina K or Simon Says Stamp. So there we have the third example finished, creating a background shadow around an image. So for our fourth example, we're going to be doing some easy masking. I'm going to be using this stamp set that came in the Love from Lizi Summer Fruits card kit. The stamp set I don't believe has been made available individually, but there are some of the add-on versions of these images of these lashes ladies available, and hopefully she makes it available as an individual purchase closer to the summer, so do keep an eye on the Love from Lizi website. I went ahead and stamped down on my 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card panel, and then I die cut just using some regular cardstock to create my super easy mask. You could use masking paper for this, but I decided to use some cardstock that I had to hand and then just covered the back of it with removable adhesive dots. So these will allow me to stick this right over the top and cover up that coloured in image, but it will remove, so it's not stuck there permanently, in case you're thinking, why did you just cover up all of that colouring? As I mentioned earlier, the Copic colours that I used will be listed below. I am definitely not a fancy Copic colorist. I'm very basic in the way that I colour, and so I decided to cut out the majority of the colouring just to save time, as this is kind of a over 20-minute long video. So now I have a stencil from Tailored Expressions. This is a beautiful mermaid scallop stencil, and I grabbed one of my blending brushes. This is the Picket Fence Studio blending brush, and I'm using it to blend on the Distress Oxide colours in Mermaid Lagoon, which is extremely appropriate, and also Peacock Feathers. So I've sped this up a bit just because it takes a little while to ink blend. You definitely want to work slow with your ink blending so you don't end up with any splodges that you can't blend out. And I like to work in layers, so I add my initial layer and then I'll switch colours again and just kind of brighten up that blue and also blend it into the more kind of greeny blue until I'm happy with the colours. And then look at that reveal. So I'll peel up that stencil, and then I'll go ahead and peel away the mask, and we have this beautiful little girl in the middle of all of that ink blending, and she was perfectly protected by our DIY easy mask. There was no fussy cutting involved, which was wonderful, and it has like a nice white halo around the image as well, which is kind of a fun look. So I finished it up with the stamp Hello Summer, and then just attached that to a card base. So now card 5, we've been building up to this one. This is probably the most intense, but stick with me and hopefully you will get it. So here I have 2 square note cards that are the exact same size, and I'm going to be layering them up to create a trifold window. Now to do that, I will need to trim a small amount off of one of the cards so they can nest inside of each other nicely. So I am going to stick these together eventually, but whilst I'm working on the die cut or the die cutting, I'm going to keep these separate. So you can see how when those back pieces are stuck together, we'll have 2 flaps that will open, so we get this trifold card design. I'm going to go ahead and place everything together and then tape the 2 front panels together. So I'm kind of doing the opposite of what I would do in the end. And this doesn't really matter too much at this point because we haven't done any stamping or any cutting, so you basically want to stick 2 of those pieces together. So we've got a double thickness in the center and then those individual side flaps on either side. So now I'm adding a die. This is from Lawn Fawn. It's from their Costume Party stamp and die set. And I'm putting that exactly where I'm going to want my image to be, and then I'll run that through my die cut machine. This particular die, it will not cut through both layers of cardstock, but it will definitely leave an impression. Now, if I was using a thinner cardstock, it would, but this is a 110-pound cardstock, which is my favourite to use for card bases. It's really thick and sturdy, so it will just leave an impression on that second piece that I can then line the die up and cut it. Now, the reason I had those pieces taped together is because I want those 2 windows to match up perfectly. I want to be able to see from the front of the card right through that first flap, right through the second one, and to the inside of my card. So I've folded up the card, and this is how it will look when I give it to the recipient, and I've lined up my stamp inside of that window. I'm going to go ahead and ink it up and then stamp that down in place. I'm just using my MISTI bar magnet to make sure nothing shifts, and then I'll press that down and we have this adorable little dress-up dinosaur inside of the window. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove that tape that was just helping me to keep everything in place whilst I was working this through and figuring out where I wanted each of the pieces. Now I'm going to add adhesive all over the back panel here, and then I will stick the other back panel together. As I say, stick with me on this, so hopefully this is making sense. If you have any questions, do let me know in the comments. And I'm just going to stick those 2 back pieces together. So then when I turn this over, I have my completed card with those 2 flaps where we can see straight through the front of the card to the back. Now I'm adding a little unicorn friend for this dressed up dinosaur. So I've added this stamp, which is much loved. That's why it's so dark. I've used it so many times that it has eventually stained a nice kind of deep black colour. It doesn't affect how the stamp works at all. As you can see, it stamps beautifully. And you can't see that unicorn until you open the card up. So to finish up this card, I added some pattern paper and also some stamping for a sentiment. And I'm kind of all over the place in this video with my time of year. I was just creating with things that I liked the look of, but for some reason I turned this into a Halloween card. So on the front I put, "I hope your Halloween is," and then magical, and then you open it up and we have that adorable little unicorn in there as a surprise. So that is the final technique where you can make a surprise window. I did this as a trifold, but you could definitely just do this with a single fold normal note card. So that is today's video complete. I hope you've learned something new while you've been here. Maybe you feel a little more justified in the expense of your coordinating dies. If you ever need help justifying a craft supply, come to me. I am your girl. I will give you reasons why it is a bargain and why you should buy it, because you can do so many things. If you are new here, I would love to have you as a subscriber. I talked in an earlier video of making a vision board about how I've set myself a subscriber goal for the year. So if you are lurking or new, you could definitely help me out by hitting the subscribe button. That is all for me today. I hope to see you back here again soon. Bye for now.